talk about what the changes are that it's begged, borrowed, and stolen from, I'm being facetious, from the ICD-11. Most importantly, however, the DSM-5 TR came out now because it didn't come out when it was supposed to. If you remember, the whole purpose of changing from Roman numerals to Arabic numerals was to accommodate micro changes in the DSM. In every previous edition of the DSM was published with a Roman numeral, DSM-1, Roman numeral 2, 3, 3R, 4, 4R, and 5. They were all Roman numerals, right? DSM-5 was the first one to come out with Arabic numerals. The goal of the reason for switching from Roman to Arabic numerals is not because they're kindlier and friendlier, they are, but because the notion was they were going to then publish subsequent revisions in short cycles. And so the DSM-5 would be revised not unlike your Microsoft. You may have a Microsoft 2.1, and soon it will be 2.2, 2.3, 2.4. So the idea was there would be a DSM 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, maybe not every year, but every couple of years, whenever particularly the neuropsychological literature demanded revisions. And the notion was you couldn't have Roman numerals if you had micro revisions like that, because a DSM-5 would look very much like, in Roman numerals, would look very much like a DSM-5.1. What does that look like? That looks a lot like a DSM-6, doesn't it? And by the time you got to something like a DSM 12.19, it would look a lot like a hieroglyphic in Roman numerals. So they had to switch over to Roman numerals. So 5 would look like 5.1. Okay, that's why they made the change to Arabic numerals. However, they did not proceed with the micro revisions. Why? Well, because they let too much water go underneath the bridge. That's the truth of the matter. By the time you got 3, 4, 5 years into it, we were no longer in the business of a micro revision. Too much had happened. For one thing, the ICD-11 had come out. So already it's like, yikes, we got to attend to what's happened there and incorporate some big stuff. Also, the literature advanced tremendously. So they waited too long for a micro revision. So then you have to think, what am I going to call this thing? Am I going to call it a DSM-5? Am I going to call it a DSM-5 TR? Am I going to call it a DSM-6? Well, you can't call it a 6 because the World Health Organization doesn't allow the American Psychiatric Association to come out with a new edition unless there's a new edition of the ICD. There is no new edition of the ICD. There's no ICD-12 even in the planning stages. So, and DSM-5 articulated obviously with the ICD-11. So you can't call it 6. So now you're torn between a T and a TR. Well, there is a history in the DSM of 1 R and 1 TR. There's a DSM-5, there's a DSM-3R, and there's a DSM-4 TR, or text revision. A text revision is more minor than a revision. So it's a coin toss. Do we call this DSM-5R or TR? It's a lot more R-ish than it is TR-ish, but it may not be as R-ish as DSM-3R, because that created some huge changes, including eliminating the entire hierarchical structure of the DSM. So they decided they would go with the TR. I think they should call it TR squared, DSM-5 TR squared, because it's actually a mega TR. It's far more than a text revision, even if you're not going to call it a revision. For one thing, it introduces new disorders. So by definition, it's not really a text revision. It's got new disorders in it. But they elected not to call it a full-blown revision, only a text revision. So that's where we are. So let's talk about these dual diagnostic systems. There are 2 of them, and we're going to talk about the DSM and the ICD. You know, we know the DSM came out in the 1950s, came out in 1952, and we'll talk about that. But the ICD actually predates the DSM by about 100 years. And to understand the origins of the ICD, it's important to go back to a time when the world was lit only by fire. Now, you don't remember this, and I don't remember this, But you will remember the tail or the wake of this. This was an era back in the 1850s. This was the era in which there were these things called World's Fairs. Maybe you've never been to one, but maybe you've heard of them, or great exhibitions. This was before Al Gore invented the internet. This is back when there was no Google, there was no Yahoo. The world was a great big place. It shrunk tremendously once we had a web browser. You could go anywhere in the world and see anything. But back in the day, people would live their entire lives and they would never see someone from the Orient. They would never see what we might call Inuit or Native Americans. They didn't have access to other cultures and places. So what they did is they would build a city, quite literally, a temporary city, and usually in a major country, a giant one, as you know, and there's still vestiges of it, is in Chicago. Devil in the White City by Eric Larson. You may have read that book. But they were in Paris. They were all over the world. In 1851, the Great Exhibition in London actually was the spawning point, if you will, for the ICD, because four statisticians, European statisticians, got together and they said, hey, look, as long as we're bringing in people from all over the world, they build a city, they populate it with people and goods and wares and technological developments from all around the world for people to come and marvel at for months or up to a year. As long as we're bringing people from around the world, why don't we do what statisticians do? And why don't we compare the quality of goods from people in different countries? Like, let's ask the question, who makes the best leather goods? Is it Portugal? Is it Spain? Is it Mexico? Who makes the best textiles? Who makes the best ceramics and pottery? And so they did quantitative statistical analyses of the goods brought in by different countries around the world, and they established who made the best widgets. Okay, 4 years later, that same group met again. They met in Brussels. And the same statisticians, they still meet every 4 years, incidentally, not just four of them. It's called the International Institute of Statistics, Statistical Institute. They meet every 4 years, and they met in Brussels 4 years later. And they said, you know, we had that genius idea last time we met. We compared the quality of goods produced around the world. Let's do the same thing this time at this World's Fair, except instead of comparing what the quality of goods are produced around the world, let's compare instead what it is that people die from. Do they die from the same thing in the Arctic areas as they do, say, equatorial regions? Well, guess what? It turns out they don't. People die very rarely of parasitic diseases in the Arctic. On the other hand, people in equatorial regions rarely die from frostbite. So it turns out people die from very different things. And they started to catalog who dies from what in what parts of the country. And that became what would be called the International Causes of Death. It started simply as a list of what people die from in different parts of the country. And it was a groundbreaker. It was a watershed event because we're demonstrating for the first time epidemiologically, the causes of death are very different in different parts of the world, and predictably so. So the database, the epidemiological database begins to grow. International causes of death. Now, that thing, international causes of death, morphed over time into what would be called the international causes of diseases, and is today the ICD. Okay, I'm not going to go through the history of the ICD, but I want to point out a couple things that are worth mentioning. The ICD currently falls under the proprietorship of the United Nations. We are a member of the United Nations. We're a founding member of the United Nations. You may remember Woodrow Wilson and the creation of the United Nations. Underneath the United Nations is the World Health Organization, and they're the ones charged with maintaining the ICD. Okay, so it's United Nations, World Health Organization, ICD. It is revised every 10 years. It goes into a revision cycle every 10 years. It comes out at different times, but it begins a revision cycle every 10 years, unlike the DSM. DSM comes out on a PRN basis every so often. Its revision cycles have been between 7 and 17 years, okay? But the ICD starts a revision every 10 years, but because it takes so long, it actually comes out at different times. But it says something important about it. because the 10 years is designed to articulate with most, not all, countries' census. The United States has a census every 10 years, as most countries do. So it tells you the ICD is fundamentally an epidemiological document. It's not a clinical diagnostic document. It was started by statisticians. Its origins were epidemiological, and that's where its strength is. That's what's baked into its DNA. Important to keep in mind because it gets paired with the DSM, which is a horse of a very different color. The only other thing